Welcome to Mrs. Miller's notes for her double block algebra class. These are the notes for section 9.2 entitled Solving Quadratic Equations by Finding Square Roots. And what we're going to do today is we're going to solve a quadratic equation algebraically. Now remember, a quadratic equation is where we have ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. Now we've seen it set equal to y, where we've graphed it and graphed a parabola. Now it's just going to be set equal to 0. So we're going to have to solve it for x. Okay? Now, the problems that we're going to see today aren't going to have this x term in there. Okay? So this bx term won't be in our equations that we're going to see today. We're just going to see the x squared and a number set equal to another number. Now this number may or may not always be 0, but remember that the a is just a number and the c is just a number. Okay, so what we're going to do first when we're solving these is we're going to undo any addition or subtraction, so that c term, we're going to move it over to the other side of the equal sign. If there's a number in front of the x squared, that a term, we're going to divide it out, or if it's a fraction, we could multiply it out. And then we're going to take the square root of both sides, because that's how we're going to get rid of that squared on the x. And then remember, when you take the square root of both sides, you technically get two answers. So we're going to write our answer with a positive negative sign in front of it. And then if we have a radical as an answer, meaning we have a square root in our answer, we're going to have to simplify it as much as we can. So let's take a look at what these problems are going to look like. We just have one example, but it has 6 parts to it. So for part A here, well, for all of them, we're going to solve the equation. If we can't solve it, we're going to write no solution. And then when we do solve it, we'll try to write our answer as an integer. Otherwise, we're going to write it as a simplified radical. Okay? Now, part A is very straightforward. It's basically saying x squared is equal to 16. So that means something times itself got you 16. You can probably think of the answer already in your head. But we have to go through those steps, so we have to make sure there's no addition or subtraction that's going on with the x squared term. The x squared is what we're trying to solve for. And here there's nothing added or subtracted behind it. There's nothing multiplied in front or divided underneath it. So we don't really have to do those first 2 steps. Okay, all we have to do is take the square root of both sides so that we can get that squared out of there. Because a squared and a square root, they undo each other. So now I'll have x equals, and the square root of 16 is 4, but it's not just 4. Remember, it's plus or minus 4. And I'm done. Okay, now for part B, again, we're trying to solve for x. There's nothing added or subtracted onto the x squared. There's no number in front that's being multiplied, no number underneath it that's being divided. So again, I can just take the square root of both sides, so that way I can get the x by itself. But now when I try to do that, I'm taking the square root of a negative 49. And if you put that into your calculator, it'll give you an error message. And hopefully you remember that that error message is occurring because you cannot take the square root of a negative number. This means that we took some number, multiplied it by itself, and got a negative. That can't happen. Because if you take a positive number times itself, you get a positive number. Or if you take a negative number times itself, you get a positive number. The only way you can get a negative is if you take a positive times a negative, and then that's not taking a number times itself. So here, whenever you are getting to a situation where you're taking the square root of a negative number, just remember that's no solution. Okay, part C, again, there's nothing added or subtracted onto the x squared. There's nothing multiplied or divided by it. So I can just take the square root of both sides. So I'll have x equals, now this 27 though, it's not a perfect square, but it's not negative either. So I can try and simplify it if at all possible. So the square root of 27, I can break that down. And again, I want to divide by my biggest perfect square that'll go into 27. And that's going to be 9. 9 times 3. And the square root of 9 is 3. And then I'll have my square root of 3 left over. Now the other thing I need to make sure I have in my answer is my plus or minus. Okay, so I'll have a plus or minus in front of that. And I can set it equal to x. Okay, now the next examples are going to have more of the addition and subtraction and multiplication and division. So for part D, again, I've got my x squared that I'm trying to isolate, but I've got a minus 5 now that's attached to it. So I have to undo that. I have to add 5 over to the other side. So then I'll have x squared, the 5 and the 5 cancel, equals 36. So now my x squared is by itself, so I can take the square root of both sides. The 36 isn't negative, so I can definitely take the square root of it. And the square root of 36 is 6. Okay, for part E, the x squared has a 4 that's being multiplied by it, so I have to undo that. I have to divide by 4. So I'll get x squared equals 196 divided by 4 is 49. And then I can take the square root of both sides. 49 is not negative, so I can definitely take the square root of it. And the square root of 49 is 7, so I'll have plus or minus 7. Okay, and part F now. This one has 2 steps to it. I have some addition that I have to undo, and I have some multiplication that I have to undo. So I have this 8 that's being added to the 2x squared. So I have to get rid of him. So I'll subtract the 8 over to the other side. Now remember, that minus stays with the 2, so it becomes like a negative 2x squared now. Then I'm going to divide by the negative 2 so I can get the x squared by itself. So x squared equals, a negative divided by negative is a positive, so that's positive 4. And now that the x squared is by itself, I can take the square root of both sides. Since the 4 is not negative, I can take the square root of it, and I'll get 2, plus or minus 2. Okay, so remember those rules for solving equations. You want to undo addition and subtraction. You want to undo multiplication and division. And then you take the square root of both sides. Put a plus or minus in front of your answer. If your answer is not a perfect square, you do want to simplify it. And if you get a negative number that you're trying to take the square root of, remember that's no solution. So practice these problems and make sure you show your work. And if you have any questions, come on in and see us before school.